First of all, thank you everybody for joining us today, and a special thank you for Sarah for being our expert and for Offit Kurman, who she represents, for sponsoring this webinar. Offit Kurman is my favorite go-to legal resource because they have a great team of a lot of really great, wonderful people. Sarah's specialty is within the nonprofit, but Offit Kurman is a great resource in general. So good to have in your back pocket. So let's go on to intros. Sarah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. As background, I'm an employment attorney, and much of my work focuses on helping nonprofits and other organizations navigate governance, compliance, risk management, employment practices, internal controls, and data privacy. What I see again and again is that most compliance problems do not start because an organization is careless or acting in bad faith. They start because roles are unclear, policies are outdated, documentation is missing, or no one owns the process. So today, my hope is we can focus on some practical systems, the kinds of things that you can actually implement, revisit annually, and prevent gaps from becoming major issues.
Thank you. Yes, I love it when we have a holistic approach to taking care of nonprofits and making sure they have that. So legal works very well with operations and process, which also goes hand in hand with HR. And then there's finances and control. So it is underlying everything. A little bit about us. I think I skipped that part, but I run WorkStream Nonprofit. Our goal is to eliminate those operations bottlenecks so people can focus on impact. So the goal of today's session is to give you a checklist that you can walk away with to take back to your organization and see what can you do and what should you be looking for operationally to make sure that you're running as effectively as you possibly can be. So again, if you haven't gotten the checklist, it's pinned in the chat. Let us know if you have any questions. And let's get started. All right. So what we're going to do throughout this presentation is that we want to walk you through, as we said, a concrete checklist. It's real, it's actionable. We want to make sure you are compliant. We want to make sure you're thinking about it. Now, I recognize nobody's getting a law degree in this 30 minutes. What we're doing is looking at the different categories of stuff that you need to be thinking about. So a lot of this is just pointing out what should we be looking at from governance and oversight, policies, documentation, finance, fundraising, compliance, HR, employment is probably the biggest one, contracts, culture and ethics, data privacy, risk management. These are all things that are essential for people to be thinking of, even though they're probably the most boring part of the organization. Although, Sarah, you might disagree with me. You might think it's the most interesting.
Depends on the day and the issue.
All right, so governance and oversight and policies and documentation. Sarah, do you want to walk through these things and tell us what people should be looking for?
Absolutely. And before we kind of dive into this, just three questions I encourage you all to think about as we go through. The first is, does your organization have the right policy or process? Second, is someone clearly responsible for it? And third, can you prove that you followed that process? So, from my vantage point, governance and oversight is the appropriate place to start because this is your foundation. So, your board is not expected to manage every operational detail, but it does need to understand its oversight role. So, that includes governance responsibilities, compliance obligations, financial oversight, conflicts of interests, and major risk areas. So a few practical items here that are really important are, first, you want to make sure you're doing annual board training. That does not need to be overly formal, but board members should understand their fiduciary duties, their role in oversight, and where the organization's key compliance risks sit. Second, you need to make sure your IRS filings and disclosures are not just an administrative task, but that they actually tell a public story about the organization's governance, finances, and accountability. Third, your conflict of interest disclosures. These need to be written, annual, and retained. It's not enough to assume people will speak up if a conflict arises. You want a process that normalizes disclosure before there is a problem. And finally, minutes matter. Board minutes should document formal approvals, major decisions, recusals, and oversight activity. If something is ever questioned later, good minutes are one of the best ways to show that the board acted thoughtfully and appropriately.
For I don't know what kind of board training is necessary, but we do have our other video on board management where we went into a lot of this more in depth, so that might be also helpful for boards. Does it need to be an official training, or it just needs to be like reminding or everyone of what they need to do?
It should be called an official training, but I would say that official training can be fairly informal and include reminders about what the board's oversight requirements are and abilities and what their fiduciary duties are.
Okay, thanks. And everyone, if you have questions, we will have time for Q&A at the end of this. So you can put them in the chat, you can hold on to them until we get there. But I want you all to take this and ask the question, like, do you have annual board training? Are you making sure that your IRS filings are current? Are you making sure that you have independent board committees? Are you making sure that you have the annual board self-assessment? Oh, can you talk more about that one? That's an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. So a board is only as good as its parts, which make up the whole. So each board member should be asked to provide a self-assessment of the board, not necessarily themselves, but how the board is doing in serving your organization annually. And those self-assessments should be shared internally to spark discussion. Or if there's issues with the board, you could get a third party to do a review of those self-assessments and then determine, whether the board's perception of how it behaves, how it acts, matches, that of the constituents it serves, right? The museum.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then yes, then you're asking, do you have minutes? Are they being recorded? And are you formally approving them? Um, does formal approval need to be signed, or can it just be put up to vote and then recorded?
I would prefer it to be signed,
Okay.
but
So
putting
that's
into vote and recording it is better than not doing it.
okay. At least we have something. Now let's get into the policy. So these are things that we need everybody to have. Um, yeah, and the documentation that you may not even be thinking about what it looks like. So Sarah, can you walk us through what are those things that we need to be thinking about?
Absolutely. So a policy is only going to be useful if it is current, understood, and actually used. So many organizations technically have policies, but they're old or no one knows where to find them. So at a minimum, in my view, nonprofits should maintain living policy frameworks around conflicts of interest, whistleblower protections, code of ethics, gift acceptance, document retention, and delegation of authority. So the phrase living policy framework is important. Policies should not be created once and then forgotten. They should have owners, review dates, and a process for updates. Another practical tool is an annual policy acknowledgement form process. It can be very simple. Staff, leadership, and board members confirm that they have received, reviewed, and agree to follow the applicable policies. It can be included when a employee handbook is first shared with, someone new to the organization. And then it can just be sent out as an annual reminder. And then one item I strongly recommend is that a delegation of authority matrix can really serve your organization. This will answer questions like who can sign contracts, who can approve grants, who can commit the organization financially, what requires board approval. The more clarity that you have around these decisions really helps prevent confusion and risk.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. So really what we're hearing is the steps is that we need is we need everybody to get those initial documents. Are there places that we can get those template documents, or do we really need to have them individualized for everyone? Or can Claude help create a basic one to start with for those who don't have anything?
I know you're not asking me to endorse AI to do employment
No,
work
no, no,
on a
no,
live stream.
no.
So I would not recommend Claude or any other AI system.
We
Proceed
need to
at your
get
own
somebody.
risk.
Hmm.
But, look, there are templates out there. If you Google them, I'm sure. And you could certainly, if you have a business owner friend who's willing to share their handbook with you, but like a good, true handbook is very individualized to your business, and you work with a lawyer every step of the way. If you're concerned about costs, there are ways to try and defray the cost for the organization, but this is really an investment that you want to make because it protects you potentially against future lawsuits. So it should, it is something to put money behind, in my view.
Okay, so we do that, and then we have the annual review and the person owning that. So make sure we all have that. Okay, so that's the probably the more the parts that aren't as affecting so much in your day-to-day work because there are more things that need to be set up. But financial and fundraising compliance and HR and employment are significant risk areas if they're not done well. Um, so Sarah, I don't know if you could just talk about the risks that we're trying to combat by having the financial measures in place and then the HR measures in place.
Of course. So financial and fundraising compliance is an area where a lot of mission-driven organizations can unintentionally create risk because they are focused, understandably, on raising and deploying resources. So restricted funds are a really good example here. If a donor gives money for a specific purpose, the organization needs a tracking system that clearly labels those funds and ensures they are used appropriately. Another major issue is charitable solicitation compliance. So if your organization raises funds in multiple states, you need to understand where registration or reporting obligations may apply. And this could be really easy to miss, especially with online fundraising. And then
Yeah.
segregation of duties. Oops, sorry.
No, no, you're totally right. Sometimes I joke that it's not the United States, it's the United Countries because every state is so, so different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Segregation of duties is another key control. So no single person should control an entire financial transaction from start to finish. For example, initiating a payment, approving it, and reconciling it. Even, in small organizations, there have to be ways to build in checks and balances so you're not dealing with a headache at the end of the day when you're just trying to run your business. I also think that depending on the organization's size and requirements, an annual independent financial review or audit may be necessary or advisable. And then beyond compliance, that process can also build trust with funders, donors, and your board. And then on the HR and employment side, compliance deserves, in my opinion, special attention because employment issues can become expensive, disruptive, and personal very, very quickly. So, where you want to start is with the basics. We touched on this a little bit already. You'll want to have a current employee handbook, signed acknowledgments, clear wage and compensation standards, documented performance reviews, and consistent offboarding procedures. Performance reviews are especially important. So many organizations only document performance when something is wrong, but consistent documentation protects both the organization and the employee. It helps set expectations, support development, and create a record if employment decisions later need to be explained.
Yeah,
So for,
yeah,
go
no, I
ahead.
would add on to the reviews and we'll get more to that when we get into HR, but it's really also used as a lever for improving performance also and getting everybody on board. So it's one often commonly missed thing, but it's so, so helpful.
Yeah. And then for organizations that are working with children or older adults or any type of vulnerable population, background checks and screening procedures are critical. So these need to be tied to the role and applied consistently.
Yeah, I do see a lot of people forgetting about those, but if you're running a camp or running some kind of anything that has to do with children, you really need to make sure that you have this in place.
And then finally, I think in the HR employment realm, the most important area to focus on, because where this is where I think a lot of risk gets missed, is offboarding. So when someone leaves, there should be a checklist that covers final pay, return of property, confidentiality reminders, and very importantly, removal of system access. I
Yes.
counsel clients all the time, and it's like they fired someone and then they don't take certain steps, and it becomes a really huge issue that could have been avoided.
Yeah, which is also when you hire somebody, you should set up their own email address within your domain. So when you shut that email address down, it automatically shuts down their access to all your tools. So that's something that some people tend to not review. And then the executive compensation, I think that's just something people need to be thinking about also is making sure that people are paid fairly. So this is where HR will come in also. This is fun. Data privacy and risk management. I'm sure we've all been hearing a lot about that. I think the risks have gone up a lot since AI has become a bigger. Sarah, I'm curious how you're seeing it, but that's a big one. And then culture and ethics. Culture is not just something that helps your organization work well, but it's also what are the guiding lines for how you're making sure that you're compliant with it, and not
Yeah,
losing responsibility.
absolutely. So I think, the key takeaway here on data privacy and risk management, it's that they're no longer just issues for large organizations. Nonprofits hold sensitive information, donor data, employee records, client information, payment data, health related information, and sometimes information about vulnerable communities. So as a result, you need to have a cybersecurity and breach response plan in place. The moment something happens is not the just time to decide, who to call, who to investigate the issue, who communicates with the affected parties, and what outside support may be needed. You want to have all of that at your fingertips so you can just activate a breach response.
Yeah, this goes beyond like the ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. This is like an ounce of prevention is like a ton of cure. And if you need a cybersecurity referral, I have lots of people I can refer you to, but it makes such a difference to be proactive.
It's also really helpful to have an incident reporting playbook. So your staff should know how to respond or report suspicious emails, lost devices, accidental disclosures, or other concerns. And leadership should know how those reports get escalated. Insurance is another important part of the risk picture. So, cybersecurity insurance and directors and officers coverage can be critical, but organizations need to have an understanding of what is covered, what is excluded, and what practices are required to maintain coverage.
Yeah, in general, I think everybody should have at a minimum directors and officers. I like to see general liability. If you're putting any information out there, you're going to want a media and PR. Again, if you need an insurance agent, I have people I can connect you to. So reach out.
And then finally, I think do an annual cybersecurity risk assessment. It's worth the spend. You can work with a vendor to do that, or if you have someone in-house that's tasked with responsibility over this area, you could assign it to them. But you do want to document that. That's important. And then finally, data retention, does really matter. So keeping everything forever is not a strategy. Organizations should maintain a data retention and deletion schedule so they know what to keep, for how long, and when to securely dispose of it.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I don't think a lot of people are thinking about it. I think 7 years is usually the max people hold on to things. All right, and culture and ethics. So why do I want to care about that? Rhetorical question, but you can answer.
Yeah,
Thank you.
no. So, in my view, compliance is not just policies and filings, it's also culture. So, a strong compliance
Hmm.
culture means people know what is expected, they feel comfortable raising concerns, and they trust that concerns will be handled appropriately. So, one practical step is assigning a compliance champion, like your hall monitor. It doesn't mean that one person is responsible for everything. It just means that someone is tracking deadlines, coordinating reviews, and making sure key items do not fall through the cracks. Training should also be practical. So instead of simply saying follow the ethics policy, use real world scenarios. What should someone do if a donor offers a restricted gift that does not align with the mission? What if a board member has a financial relationship with a vendor? What if your staff see something that feels wrong, but are unsure whether to raise it to the level of a formal complaint?
Yeah, and I have seen things go drastically wrong because there were no cultures of ethics. People didn't know what to compile, what their standards were. So developing the standards and sticking to them really prevents a lot of problems later on. So again, ask yourself, how do we do this? Now, if you're small, you may not need to have a person doing it, but I want you to at least be thinking about it and then coming back to this on an annual basis.
Yep. And then finally, my last suggestion would be that organizations consider an anonymous reporting channel. So, people are more likely to speak up when they know there is a safe, clear way to do so. And at times, anonymity matters because some people don't speak up because they're fearful of retaliation.
Contracts. Contracts are probably the thing that people are actually using the most often, and it's probably most top of mind, but are probably not thinking about what needs to go into it and what matters in a contract. I don't know if
So,
that's what you see.
yeah. So, in my view, contracts are another area where small process improvements can prevent major problems. So, every organization should have a process for reviewing vendor contracts before signing. The issue is not just going to come down to price, it's also indemnification, insurance, confidentiality, data security, termination rights, automatic renewals, scope of work, and who owns the actual work product. So, that is, in my view, something that you really need to keep in mind. You also want to make sure you have a centralized contract repository because if a contract are sitting, in inboxes over here, or folders, it's hard to track obligations, renewal dates, notice periods, and termination windows. If you have employees, your at-will disclaimers and handbook language should be clear and consistent. And the goal is to avoid creating unintended promises or ambiguity related to the status of their employment with the organization. For contractors, nonprofits should be really careful about worker classification, workers' compensation obligations, confidentiality, and access to organizational data. Contractors should generally have written agreements that define scope, payment, confidentiality, ownership of work, and insurance expectations. One of our bullets here is that, contractors should carry their own workers' comp policy. They absolutely have to. I've seen so many cases recently coming after people for this very issue because they don't get it and then they get hurt at work and then they're arguing that they're an employee and it's a whole mess. Um, Consider having your contractors sign non-disclosure agreements that can be baked into the agreement I was talking about moments ago. You just want to make sure that whatever it is that they're allowed to gain access to within the organization, you're protected so that, they can't leave, go elsewhere and start your competitor and try and trade on all the work that you've done and built for your organization. And then, we have developed your standard contract templates. It's a really good idea, especially if you have multiple employees in similar positions. You should have a template. Everyone's agreement should basically look the same, with the exception of compensation details or address. But having those on hand makes consulting with your lawyer really easy, because you can just say, I use a standard template. Here's where I'm hung up. The compensation model we're contemplating for this new hire differs from what we've traditionally put there. Can we talk this through? Can you help me? Saves you money, first and foremost, but you also should have a relationship with a lawyer where you can pick up the phone to just have that conversation quickly and know that you have the document that you can own and finalize and get to your eager candidate, sooner rather than later. So you're not waiting a week or two for someone to review it.
Yeah, I know legal fees are expensive, but the most important thing that can hurt you the most, and I've seen it hurt you pe people the most, is not having contracts, not classifying people properly. So getting that taken care of is probably your biggest risk factor and biggest item to address. All right, thank you, Sarah. That was very helpful, very informative. Um, so I hope everybody takes this checklist and really goes back to think, what do we have? You have homework on that to see what do you need to do to make your organization stronger and healthier. Our next sessions coming up are with Kristen Berger on Berger HR. That is going to be on HR. It's all about HR policies and building and hiring rate and all that. And then we have Leon Seaman with workflow. Um, Systems at Scale, and Jessica DeVito from the Nonprofit People about fundraising. Now you'll see in the chat we have a survey link, so please let us know what helps you the most. We make our programs to help improve operations. And if you can give us a minute of your time to fill that in, that will very much help us. So thank you again, Sarah. This has really been very insightful and really helpful. I appreciate it. And now we will hand it over to everybody for a Q&A. So please, if you have a question, you can either unmute yourself to ask, or you can pop it in the chat, and we'll take advantage of having an expert here. While people are thinking, Sarah, can you tell me, what do you see most often people are doing wrong? I know there's a lot of things that we went through. What do you see comes up back to bite them most often?
That usually it has to do with, I have this employee that's been a problem, and we haven't done a great job of documenting it. And she's now feeling like she's at the end of her rope and has threatened some kind of legal claim. What do I do? We did nothing wrong. How is this happening to me? Parade of horribles. And, you know, I asked for the things I would need to defend the lawsuit. Where are the performance reviews? How well documented are these issues? And, they come back with nothing, and it becomes, a much more delicate dance in trying to resolve the matter and get the client what they want, which is that this employee leave. But it's because they don't have the right documentation.
Yeah, so that's another thing. Like, a lot of these things are like little things you can do in advance that would make such a big difference if you just had them done earlier. You probably wish you could have just gone back in time and be like, please just have your documentation in place. One question I have, so I know that we have the United Countries, not the United States, because every state is different. What happens if you don't comply and you don't file in every state where you're getting donations, or there's just so many different things that you can be thinking about, where you have employees, you do one part, but you don't do another. What are the risks people are actually looking at? I mean, that's why we hired Beth to take care of it. Like, she's our compliance manager, and I'm so thankful we have her on our team for that. But what happens if people don't do that?
Fines, penalties, you know, headaches.
it's going to create problems later on. So this is also where we're kind
It's
of
going to
preventative.
create quite a few I mean, it's not, that specific area is, I advise on the compliance and how to comply. My clients don't often end on the other side, but usually it's penalties, you're on the government's radar, what else are they going to come after you in that state for?
Yeah. Which is similar also if you pay somebody as a 1099 and not a W-2, that opens up a whole can of worms. All right, but this is everyone, it's your time to ask questions. So this is not supposed to be just about me asking questions. So what questions do you have about anything with your compliance, your risk management, the things that you need to have in place? For classifications of workers there, what's the typical guideline of when they need to be a W-2?
So there isn't. It really should be a case by case analysis. You need to look at a variety of factors. There's a 20-factor test that the IRS puts out. It's called the control test. There are, different tests that are applied in different jurisdictions, but, do you control the method and manner of how they perform the work? Are they required to work certain hours? Who supplies the equipment? There are a lot of individualized decisions that have to go into it. So there are no hard and fast rules.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Some questions. Can you repeat the part about contractors needing to have workers' comp? Under what circumstances? Like, does it also apply to individuals?
So if you have an individual that's working or excuse me, as a contractor versus an LLC working as a contractor, is that the distinction?
I'm not sure. I wonder if it's maybe a person hiring another person. Maybe if it's not a company. I don't know. Do you want to clarify,
So
Isabel?
the context is that independent contractors are usually not covered by the hiring company's workers' compensation policy because workers' comp generally covers employees, not true independent contractors. So, the issue becomes that if a contractor is injured and later found to be an employee, the company may owe workers' compensation benefits, penalties, premiums, and possibly face labor law consequences. So if you have a true independent contractor, they should maintain their own coverage or an occupational accident policy because it will ensure that you don't have the misclassification analysis done for you by the workers' compensation board if the individual is ever injured on the job. So
Okay.
it's just a level of protecting yourself.
Okay. So if you have a true 1099 and would pass all the tests for the IRS compliance of 1099, technically you wouldn't have to worry about workers' comp. But since misclassification often has some gray lines, we want everybody to have that. Otherwise, it can open too many problems for you. Is that a correct way of stating it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Um, on that note, as an individual contractor, I have never bought myself workers' comp, so I've not required it of my contractors, but maybe I should.
I would.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I personally haven't done that either, but maybe I should. All right, next question. How to classify exempt versus hourly employees? I think this is salary and overtime
Yeah,
questions.
yeah. So exempt and non-exempt are wage and hour classifications under the Fair Labor Standards Act or FLSA. So non-exempt means that the individual is covered by minimum wage and overtime rules, and they have to be paid at least minimum wage and generally receive overtime at 1.5 times their regular rate for hours worked over 40 in a work week. And they can be hourly or salaried. So an exempt employee is someone that is exempt from FLSA overtime requirements and sometimes minimum wage requirements because the job meets a legal exemption. So common exemptions include executive, administrative, professional, certain computer and outside sales roles. So, the key determinant is really does, the employee meet what's called both the salary basis and salary level test, meaning do they earn enough money? And they also have to satisfy what's called a duties test. And the duties test looks at what the person actually does, not just the job title. So job titles, do not alone decide exemption status. Words like manager, administrator, or specialist are not by itself enough. The actual responsibilities and pay structure matter.
Okay, so that's something that we need to really talk to people, but you need to really keep it in mind. You don't just want to make everybody exempt because you actually need to be in compliance. Okay, next question. What should an ideal volunteer contract have as a must and what's optional?
It all depends on what you want. So, I think the ideal agreement would specifically lay out what is expected of the volunteer and what they receive in return for completing, the volunteer stint. I think it needs to lay out, like how maybe expenses are reimbursed, if you foresee a volunteer potentially, incurring business related costs.
Hmm. Probably some kind
Um,
of NDA, maybe, or maybe not.
yeah, you would probably want to include a confidentiality clause in there, but really it depends on how you're going to structure your volunteer program.
Okay, so yeah, it depends. All right. So this is definitely a good question. Maybe not in the scope of this discussion, but I heard that if we let employees keep their computers when they leave, this is a taxable benefit. I have heard this question so many times from people. Is Do we give them computers? Who owns it? Is it a taxable benefit if it goes to them?
Call your accountant.
Okay.
I'm not, I mean, I'm just being honest with you. I can tell you like what I know to be true, which is that current IRS guidelines say that usually if you let an employee keep a company computer when they leave, the value is a taxable benefit or wage to the employee. So the usual treatment would be the taxable amount is the equivalent of the fair market value of the computer at transfer minus any amount the employee pays for it.
Yeah.
And then, the IRS says fringe benefits are taxable unless specifically excluded.
Mhm.
And taxable fringe benefits generally include wages.
Yeah. So what I've seen some people do is just give their employees a bonus, which is taxable to cover the cost of a laptop, or I see them owning it and then they turn it back in when they're finished working at that company. Otherwise you do need to talk to your accountant about that. Okay, next question. We are hiring college interns. Do they need to be on W-2? Can we do them at 1099? Is there any other regulations about it? It's for a 6-week long program.
So my first question would be, are they getting any type of educational credit for,
Let's assume
you know,
not.
the work? But the safest default, in my view, is usually a W-2 employee.
Yeah.
So use the W-2 when the intern is paid and you direct their work. Um, you know, I think for payroll purposes, they are an employee. If you're setting their schedule, assigning work, supervising them, providing tools, and the work benefits your organization. A 1099 would only be appropriate if the intern would need to operate in an, independent business and they have complete control over their work and their delivery. But like I'll just take it as a time to remind you that you know, unpaid internships also exist. So Department of Labor uses what's called the primary beneficiary test to determine whether the intern or employer is the primary beneficiary of the relationship. If the employer is the primary beneficiary, the intern, is an employee and must be paid. But if the intern is the beneficiary, then it can be unpaid.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I think what we're saying is that default to W-2, pay people on salary. You don't risk anything really, right, by paying them as a W-2, but you do risk a whole lot if you misclassify them. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Besides the IRS, are there any other entities that audit nonprofits? I guess who are you going to get in trouble with?
Everyone audits nonprofits. The state will audit nonprofits. Um, so it's really jurisdictionally dependent. Um,
Okay.
I think you have to separate it, right? So there might be like a financial statement audit that's done by an independent CPA or public accounting firm.
Mhm.
Um, there might be state charity compliance review at the state level done by the state attorney general. There might be a grant funder audit. There could be an internal audit.
We want you to always be in a state of audit readiness. That means with all your regulations, all your policies, all your finances. That's how we try to keep that in mind when we work with everybody, whether it's financially or advisory. Okay. For the exempt employee, if they work over 40 hours per week, should they earn comp time? And if yes, at the rate of 1 or 1.5 after 40 hours.
So for a properly classified exempt employee, no, they're not required to earn comp time for working over 40 hours under the federal FLSA. So exempt generally means that they're exempt from overtime requirements, assuming they meet the salary and duties tests. So again, the DOL's exemption guidance describes the common executive, administrative, and professional exemptions as requiring salary basis pay and qualifying duties. You could, of course, may voluntarily, offer some kind of comp time or extra PTO to exempt employees as an internal policy, but that would be a policy choice, not an overtime obligation. The exempt employee just always must receive their guaranteed salary, and you should not, dock salary based on hours worked in a way that undermines the salary basis exemption.
Okay. But then they can still have like PTO or take a day off or something, and that if they don't have enough time off or something, if that's part of your policy, they can still be docked at that point, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, they're just not docked because they took off 2 hours early because you're assuming that they're putting in a lot of their time. Like all our founders are putting in overtime, probably, if you're anything like me. All right, last question from this person. We have student count. It's not a last question for everybody. I was just reading it. We are still open for questions. We have student counselor volunteers under 18 years old for the summer. What types of forms or contracts should they sign?
I don't think that a volunteer agreement is going to be enough for folks under 18. So I would create a minor volunteer packet that would be signed by both the minor and their parent guardian. And in there you could include the minor volunteer agreement and acknowledgement that's signed by both the minor and the parent guardian. And that would confirm volunteer status, role, schedule, expectations, supervision, and that the student is not an employee. You'd also want a parent guardian consent form that's only signed by the parent or guardian, and that would give permission for the minor to participate as a volunteer. I would include a description of the volunteer position, copies of the code of conduct, and I think you'll need to add a youth protection policy acknowledgement in there. You'd also want a confidentiality agreement, a medical treatment and emergency treatment authorization, a liability waiver and an assumption of risk, potentially a photo, video, media release, a transportation permission form,
A lot of
a,
stuff. Yeah.
a background check, and the handbook acknowledgement.
Yeah, that is a lot of things. So we should definitely make sure that they're taken care of well. Um, I did not know that, Sarah. Thank you. Okay, for financial control, should the executive director actually be the one to approve all the payments, or can it be somebody else?
So this goes to our checks and balances, right? So I think it can be someone else. I don't think the executive director has to be the final approver for every payment. And many nonprofits, frankly, do better if there is a written approval structure and don't just rely on the executive director. Again, it's just, best practice is separation of duties. So no one person should control the entire payment process from request, approval, payment, bookkeeping, to bank reconciliation.
Yeah, we want to have that transparency layer. Again, that goes back to the audit readiness, and it means that people are acting with fiscal responsibility. So we do want the ED to have insight into the finances, but often the ED bottlenecks too much, and we don't want that to happen. If the fiscal manager is the one who approves final payments, so who should approve their reimbursement request?
Someone else
Someone else. Just appoint that
doesn't,
other person.
I don't think I mean, it probably shouldn't be, a low-level employee that mans the front desk. But, the general rule is that no one should be approving their own reimbursement requests. So it needs to be approved by someone independent and senior enough to review expenses.
I
So
could,
maybe the executive director reviews, and approves the fiscal managers. And if it's like a large or unusual reimbursement, maybe it's the executive director and the treasurer or a finance committee.
this goes back to the financial approvals, like who's allowed to approve what that we talked about earlier. So put in all those things, like who is allowed to approve what? What if the threshold is like over $1,000, you want a more senior level of review, but think about all those scenarios so that we make sure everything is caught and monitored properly. Okay, any more questions? There's so many traps I feel like people can fall into, and so many things people just aren't aware of. Hopefully, this give people a little bit more insight um into it. And of course, if anybody needs any help, Sarah's here. We're here. Our goal is to help you succeed and win and thrive. Um, and we do that by having good foundations. All right, again, a reminder, if you haven't done the survey, please do so. I'll give you all another minute, but if not, I think if we have no more questions, then we can let everyone go a little early. And thank you, Sarah. This has been very helpful and very informative. Glad
Thanks
we
for having
invited
me.
you.